Hello and welcome to poet and novelist Chris Meredith and Professor Diana Wallace from University of South Wales. Chris has been the keynote speaker of the Association for Welsh Writing in English's 2015 conference, and so we're going to ask him to have a short conversation with Diana, and we're going to ask him to read one of the poems that's kind of related to the theme of this year's conference, which was The Country and the City, which, as Chris pointed out, covers everything. Because we're not as stupid as we look. Are we, Diana?
We certainly aren't. The theme of the conference was the country and the city, rural and urban Wales. And I'd like you to just say a little bit, if you don't mind, about how your work generally connects to those themes.
Well, as I said yesterday evening, I started off thinking this has nothing to do with my work or is only incidentally relevant. And then I realised, as Aidan's just mentioned, that it sort of covers everything. And from that point on, I thought everything I've written could fit into this. And I started making a list that, had I gone on, would have included everything I'd ever written. So I had to think about it a bit more. And what occurred to me was that it's actually about the idea of an opposition between urban and rural is what's interesting, rather than the fact that this covers everything, really. I didn't get around to saying that last night, but I think that's the case. So I started thinking about the idea that in some ways, like so many oppositions, it's a false one. And that it's hard to distinguish between the urban and the rural, and what we mean by the rural can be different things. You know, do we mean wilderness? Do we mean managed land? Do we mean farmland, and so on? So, and I thought about the way these things have played in my work, and it led me to sort of pick out a thread, really, in my work, which I suppose I knew was always there, but I'd never picked it out in this particular way. So it became an interesting experience to choose mainly poems which seemed to me to connect with ideas of town, city, and things that were not town and not city, and see how they've been present in my work, almost unknown to me, and the way in which they connect up in a kind of imagery that echoes and develops, I hope develops, in my work. So that's been interesting, you know, to look at my work afresh. Through the lens of the theme of the conference.
I think this is one of the things that critics can do, and that's actually draw your attention to things in your work that perhaps you hadn't even noticed. And for me, there's a very clear a clear shift, if you like, from shifts right at the beginning of your work, your novel, through to the Book of Idiots, in terms of your interest in place and also your interest in borders and liminality, and also those shifts from the post-industrial to the rural and back again. Do you recognise that? Or is that something I'm imposing on your work?
To some extent, you know, it's just that the distinctions are so complex and sometimes illusory, and yet sometimes very helpful as well. You know, I mean, as it happens, my life I spent my early years in the old industrial area of South Wales, in Prifysgol, where I was born and brought up, and I've spent most of my adult life in Brecon. Nominally in rural Wales, you know, so I've kind of crossed a border like that in my life in a strange way, yet places are very close together. I'll tell you something happened to me some years ago. I was interviewed for a radio programme, a Welsh radio programme, and the interviewer asked me, so you live in Brecon now, where are you from originally? I told him Prifysgol, and he said, do you ever think of going back there? And I said, well, yes, of course, I've got family there and I visit and so on. And the same day, I had a friend from New Zealand who was living in Wales at that time. And he said, where are you from originally? And I said, well, I'm from a place called Prifysgol, which is 26 miles away over those mountains. And he said, haven't you ever thought of leaving this place? So they were both valid questions, you know, because in a sense they seem to me worlds apart in some ways, but in a sense they're actually the same place, and it's a matter of perspective, and that was kind of enlightening, you know, and Brecon's not so different, even though it is rural, it seems to me.
Mm. Yes, going on to Griffrey, your novel Griffrey, which is historical, that you've still got that movement from urban to rural, even there, haven't you? That's set in the time of the Norman incursion into Gwent. And you've still got a shift even in that novel between the rural and the urban.
Well, one of the things that came out in looking at the stuff of this conference. It was stuff I already kind of knew, but it came more sharply into focus. Was I think when I was talking last night, off the cuff, I called it over there-ness, because it always seems to me in my life, towns and cities have been places that have been over there somewhere, where supposedly the centre of things is going on. And I've always had an intuition that that's not necessarily true. Cities are not necessarily where the centres are, and that actual historical progress goes on quietly in all kinds of strange corners. And it's not. I've got a deep distrust of the big parade. That's the kind of thing that's going on. And even in Griffrey, I realise I have Griffrey being born, kind of out there in the sticks. And of course, there are no cities as we'd understand them now. But there's a moment where Griffrey visits Cardiff, not Cardiff, but Llandaff, while what's now Llandaff Cathedral is being built. And that, in a sense, is a representation of that centre being built by the over there.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking of, that movement across.
And then later on, he's through circumstances, he's taken to Caerleon, where the prince's court is. And of course, it's the ruins of a sort of a Roman city in a way. And there's that over there-ness again, but he's always actually from somewhere else visiting that. And I think I've realised that's been a kind of a motif in my work that's come more into focus over the course of this conference, that idea of over there-ness. And I realise I've picked that motif up many times in different forms, in different fictions and sometimes in poems too.
Yes, you keep coming back to it and reworking it, which is a good introduction to the poem you're going to read, which is about borders and edges. And perhaps you'd just say a little bit about it first and then read it for us. Okay,
this is a poem called Borderland, and it's actually set out in what passes almost for wilderness nowadays in Britain, in the Black Mountains. And I was asked to write some poems about the Black Mountains and about some damage to the peat uplands. And as a result of talking to some friends of mine, somebody asked the question, I don't know why it is that certain writers are drawn to these upland, these barren places. What's this about? And it occurred to me then, as I was thinking about the work I was doing on these poems about the Black Mountains, that it's to do with the idea that out on an edge somewhere is where meaning is constructed. And it occurred to me that the word ffin, the Welsh word for border, is in the middle of the Welsh word for definition, definiad. So the idea that meaning is to do with the edge of something is kind of built into the etymology of the word. Because it's in the English word definition too, in a less obvious way. And the Black Mountains, of course, is famously the borderland of Raymond Williams. But it's a border in all kinds of other senses as well. And it's a borderland between farmed and not farmed, between enclosed and unenclosed, between earth and air.
Yes, which is one of the themes of the collection it's in, isn't it?
Yeah,
histories.
Yes, air is a word that kept recurring in my poems, and it's come out in all kinds of ways. That's another kind of a motif, this image. So borderland really takes that idea of, in almost aphoristic way, of edges, the over here rather than the over there, being the place on this edge, being the place where meaning is located. So it's called borderland, and ffin, as I said, is the Welsh for border, and there's a place in the Black Mountains too called Capel y Ffin, and here it is.
If you read us through it, that would be lovely. Okay. Thank you.
Borderland. You'll find a ffin inside each definition. We see what is when we see what it's not. Edges are where meanings happen. On the black whaleback of this mountain, earth curves away so sky can start to show a ffein's a kind of definition, where skylarks climb across earth's turn to air, and pulsing muscle turns to an artful song, the edge that lets a meaning happen. Live rock can yield to mortared stone, a city to a castle, then a shepherd's hut, where ffein's contained inside a definition, where the lithic turns into the human. Here's where things fall together, not apart, at edges that let meanings happen. And self here blurs into annihilation, larkfall, earthfall, skyfall, manfall, each create the fiend that is the place of definition, the edges where we see our meanings happen.